Ok, pessoal, oficialmente agora estamos começando mais uma Entre Mundus, que é o canal de entrevista da Unus Mundus, que é a revista digital da Academia ABC². Estou vendo aqui vários nomes conhecidos entrando na conversa. Espero que vocês já conheçam a Unus Mundus, mas para quem não conhece, ela é a revista digital da Academia ABC². Basta você colocar aí no Google Unus Mundus, uma revista que já tem aí seus 2 anos de existência, fornecendo uma série de materiais gratuitos na interface entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia, com discussões profundas, interessantes, com vários temas sensacionais, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente tem feito um grande esforço para fornecer essas discussões em uma linguagem acessível, uma linguagem que não especialistas sejam capazes de entender, de ler, de aprender, e tem sido sensacional, né? Ao longo desses anos, a gente tem, na nossa revista, vinculado ensaios, artigos, colunas, os textos vencedores dos nossos radares da ABC², também os podcasts gravados com Bíblia, e também lá no site da Unus Mundus, da nossa revista, você vai encontrar todos os vídeos da Entre Mundus, que é o nosso canal de entrevista, no qual nós entrevistamos grandes pensadores, grandes autores que têm dado contribuições para o diálogo entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia. E hoje não é diferente, nós temos como convidado muito especial um grande autor, um grande pensador, assim, muito original, muito criativo, mas também com as qualidades acadêmicas do rigor, da profundidade, que é o Drew Johnson, que eu já vou apresentá-lo. Mas antes, deixa eu rapidamente aqui apresentar para vocês os nossos convidados da casa, que vão me auxiliar na conversa e na entrevista com o Drew. Primeiro, a minha amiga Ana Bezerra, que é doutora em Linguística pela Universidade de Campinas. Tem a pesquisa dela centrada no estudo das emoções na Roma Antiga, em especial no estoicismo romano de Lúcio Aneu Sêneca. Em sua trajetória acadêmica, ela já foi visiting scholar não sei falar italiano, né? Mas na Scuola Normale Superiore de Pisa e também na Universidade de Nova York. Em seu último trabalho, recentemente publicado, ela escreveu um comentário literário ao Cântico dos Cânticos, ainda que será publicado em breve, esse ano, pela editora Mundo Cristão. Ana, muito obrigado, viu, por estar aqui com a gente. Além disso, nós temos também o meu querido amigo gaúcho, não sei como, né, mas um querido e grande amigo, que é o Tiago Garros, graduado em Biologia pela Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, mestre e doutor em Teologia pela Faculdade Este, com período de sanduíche na Universidade de Oxford, sob orientação de Alistair McGrath. Atualmente, ele continua dando várias contribuições no Brasil e mundo afora para pensar interfaces de fé e ciência, e também é professor de ensino básico e ensino médio em Florianópolis. E, finalmente, com grande alegria, que nós temos aqui como convidado o professor Drew Johnson, que é pesquisador sênior da Templeton no Wycliffe Hall, na Universidade de Oxford, é professor adjunto de religião no Hope College, em Holland, Michigan, uma cidade linda. É diretor do Abrahamic Theistic Origins Project, do qual ele vai poder contar um pouquinho, e também do diretor do Center for Hebraic Thought. É editor do The Biblical Mind e apresentador do podcast The Biblical Mind e co-apresentador do podcast Unscript. Então, para você que curte podcasts, né, que está aí no mundo digital e entende inglês, são excelentes. E, antes disso, ele foi skinhead, baterista de punk rock, veterano do exército, supervisor de TI e pastor. Segundo ele mesmo, todas as coisas do mundo que se espera que seus filhos nunca venham a fazer, né? Tudo que você espera que seus filhos nunca venham a fazer. Então, é com uma grande alegria que a gente recebe o professor Drew Johnson. E, pessoal, vocês estão aqui convidados. Agora a gente vai mudar a conversa para o inglês, tá bom? Lembrem-se, quem está chegando agora, que dá para ter legenda simultânea. O pessoal aqui no chat vai explicar para vocês. É muito fácil, só clicar nos settings aí, tá bom? Deixa eu mudar agora a chavinha da linguagem. Okay, guys. So, in the name of academia, ABC², it's an honor, it's a privilege today to have Professor Drew Johnson with us. Thank you very much, Drew, for accepting our invitation.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Prazer.
Very good. So, let's just jump into the questions. Tiago Garros and Ana, as I said, will be joining me to present thoughtful, provoking questions to Professor Drew Johnson. And I would like to start just asking a very philosophical question. Who are you, Professor Drew Johnson?
I feel like you're stealing things from me.
Yeah, kind of.
Is that a real question?
Yes, just tell us and our audience very quickly your trajectory, how you end up doing what you're doing, your interest for the Hebrew Bible, and in this specific topic of science and the Bible.
Yeah, so it's a very long story how I ended up doing all of these things. It's probably too boring to review. But essentially, I went to seminary, not planning on becoming a pastor, and then ended up working in the church as a pastor for 8 years, which changed many of the questions theologically and philosophically I was asking. I did a degree in philosophy while I was a pastor and started teaching philosophy at a public or at the state university in the United States, which raised many other questions. But the main question in studying philosophy and teaching it is I realized I went back and started working on the Hebrew Bible, and that philosophers were basically asking the same kind of questions that the biblical authors were dealing with as well. There's not much new. Biblical authors just have a very different way of approaching philosophical questions and exploring them. And then I saw nobody was talking about this. Yeah, and I don't know if you felt this way in your own research, but you feel like you see something and then you think, well, nobody's written a book on this, nobody's talking about it. And then you think, well, maybe I don't see something, maybe I misunderstand something. And so I kept trying the idea out over and over again. Do the biblical authors have their own philosophical style, their own way of reasoning through the nature of reality? And I got enough feedback and enough grip, good enough arguments to convince a few people that something was going on in the Bible and it was worth pursuing. And so, interestingly, that project, I've written quite a few books on the kind of the philosophical side of the biblical literature. But this book on Darwin was really a case study. And I'm really interested to see what you guys think of the translations down here, how it's working. But that was really a test of the thinking, which was if the biblical authors are thinking about the nature of reality, including, how scientists might even think about reality, then can we figure out what they have to say about, ethics? Of course, lots of people write about what the biblical authors think about ethics. Can we think about justice? Yeah, lots of people have written about biblical views of justice. All right, well, what about metaphysics? What about the physics of naturalism and the metaphysics of naturalism? And so for me, looking at Darwin and his view of natural selection alongside conversation with the biblical author's view of natural selection was basically a test to see, does this work? It so happened that I kind of already knew where the biblical authors were going with this because I'd been thinking about it for years. So that's what I'm doing. And, future projects are probably not going to be as out there as the Darwin book because that's a little bit adjacent to my expertise.
Yeah.
But similar types of projects.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Thank you.
I don't have to admit all these people in, right?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, we're doing this.
Okay.
Yeah. So, good. I just inviting Ana, please, to ask her first question.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you again, now virtually. I have been reading your work, Knowledge by Ritual, and there you show that rituals bring participants to know something about the world that they could not have known otherwise. And you also say that even the scientific community is recognizing now the importance of embodied rituals in their scientific practices. So my question is if you could tell us a bit more about that and how the positivist approach to knowledge is maybe a dead end for us as scientists and also as Christian scientists.
Yes. Small question. Let me see if I can capture a chunk of that question. I think here's my experience and I'm directing this project now where I'm working with scientists and theologians together here at Oxford, is that for many very intelligent scientists who are very good at what they do and they truly understand some aspect of the universe through doing their scientific practice, if you ask them the question, how do you know that what you know is real? Like, how do you know that how are you so confident that you actually know this thing about entomology or chemistry or whatever? And they will typically give you the positivist story. Well, I objectively collect facts, through clinical observation, and we have controls for those facts. I think all of this is good, by the way. I'm not making fun of it. I'm talking about the story about science, not science itself. And then, we create scientific facts and data, usually in some kind of empirical mathematical form, and we put that data and those facts in a pile, and then we sift through that heap of facts to make theories about what else might be going on. And then, as somebody who's done some work in philosophy of science, I'm looking at them just thinking, no philosopher of science thinks that's true, right? for this last 75 years or so, right? And so when they say, well, what do people think is going on? Yeah, and I described to them one story that I think is particularly good. Michael Polanyi's and Thomas Kuhn's story, I think, works pretty well. And they always have the same reaction every single time. They say, oh, yeah, that's actually what's going on in my life. That's actually why I'm confident. And the story that they like better than their own is that they actually are biased in a good way, like a Gadamerrian way. They're biased so that they can see significance where you and I can't, right? I've never worked in biology or chemistry. So if you show me tables of data or spreadsheets or walk me into a lab, it all looks very nice to me, but I have no idea what's significant and what is not significant. So they're biased in a community by the community, and they're biased or trained or traditioned, we could say, through ritual practices. So if you ask, how does somebody come to understand, any phenomenon? I'm thinking of even something like as simple as correlational coefficients, right? That you have to have some grasp of correlational coefficients and multivariate probabilities in order to do kind of any kind of science. I worked in social science for my undergraduate psychology, and certainly you need to understand the basics of those things. And the question is, well, okay, how do you come to understand those concepts, the conceptual map that you can use in order to explore the world and see significance where others cannot? Well, how did I learn it? I sat in a room with 50 other people and wrote out exercises with different numbers in them, where we're basically doing the same exercise every time, but they put different numerals in the exercise. I don't know how to describe that anthropologically other than just saying that's a ritual where you take a normal activity, you strategically change it for this other goal. So the normal activity where it would be writing or maybe doing basic arithmetic, adding 1 + 1 = 2. And now you're strategically making them repeat that activity over and over again as you're explaining to them what is significant about this activity. And magically, over time, you come to understand the world correlationally in a statistical way, right? In a probabilistic way. Now, you might not understand all the problems philosophically with correlations, and the idea of probability and inductive arguments, if they're even arguments at all. But you understand how to think correlationally, and then you can extend that thinking out into the world, in which the way you extend it into the world is by scripting and performing rituals in order to see something. And anybody who's read a scientific journal article, I mean, the very first, well, it's not the first thing after the abstract, the introduction, is the methodology, which is the script. If you want to see what I saw in my lab, perform this, anthropologists would say, perform this ritual in the way that we did it, and you should be able to see the same thing that we saw. So that the way that argues against positivism seems so obvious to me. Maybe I feel like do I need to say anything more? But if I do, let me know, or maybe some of you could explain it better than I could.
That's very good, very good summary with very lived examples of your thinking about that. I'll have more questions about that later. But now I invite Tiago, please, to ask his first question.
Yeah, I'm gonna go along the same path as my daughter just came. Captando uma entrevista aqui, tá? That's Lucia, by the way. I was gonna go along the same lines, and you mentioned a lot through your work, working with the philosophy of the biblical authors, and everything more or less talks to each other in your work in terms of the ritual, and then of course the lived practices of reality, the lived practices or the lived experience of reality. It's a phrase that you every once in a while we read in your work, and then and you just described that scientists see the world and they don't even realize that they are seeing the world based on their lived experience of reality, which is the way they collect data. But then transferring to the biblical authors, and this is where I was going to get, you mentioned that the biblical authors have this comprehension and understanding of reality, which is based in their lived experience, their rituals and all that. So it's very important for us as people so distant from that reality to try to get into that world and understand their way of thinking and their philosophy and their metaphysics and all that, for us to have more accurate understanding of biblical interpretation, let's say. So this, and to understand the Bible for what it is. And basically, this is your argument all over the place in your philosophy of Hebraic thought and in the Darwin book and all that. Could you, again, small question, could you explain to us how that more or less works in practical terms for people that are not familiar with your books and not familiar yet with the way? What do you mean by lived experience of reality? What do you mean of us getting to understand the biblical mind in this sense?
Yeah. And can I ask for clarification? Do you mean give examples from the Bible or both sides?
Both sides. Like how what do you mean by, for us to read in that way?
Right.
And maybe one example from the Bible for us to understand how that works.
Yeah. So I as I was describing scientific positivism, as we typically call it, the issues, this is my take. It's a cold take. It's not a hot take, but it's very cold. But my take is that essentially the problem is we are hung up on trying to understand the world, even in our mathematics. Sabina Hassenfeld has been arguing this recently, is that even mathematics and physics are held hostage to this idea that good theory should be simple and eloquent. And she's now arguing, well, why would we think that, right? Well, unless you're hung up with Greek theology or Greek philosophy, Neo-Aristotelianism, or unless you're hung up with some kind of Neoplatonic view of the world, or you have some version of Christianity that's fully merged with those Greek theologies, why would you think the simplest explanation would be the most accurate? And so I think that's an example of where I would like to say we often try to describe philosophically, and then we try to do it scientifically by saying how we would like it to be the case that we knew things. We would like it to be the case that if we knew everything exhaustively, and if we had a computer big enough to put all of those facts in them, then we would know everything. We could hit a button. You know, you're getting a little bit this with quantum computing. It's kind of like this might be the thing that we could put everything into. If we could just measure and sense everything and have a computer big enough to do it, then we would know. And we would know with certainty, and we wouldn't have to deal with all this inductive and maybe not, and correlation coefficients. And so I take the approach the opposite way around. Let's talk about how we actually know things, which is why I described the story of science. And I think there's very important scientific studies on how rational are people. You know, there's this assumption, especially in economics, it went way too long in economics, this assumption that people are basically rational people and they make rational decisions. And so you pull the levers of rationality in order to get them to make economic choices. And then, you know, there are these psychologists that said, are people rational? Do they actually follow these rules of logic? And they just went out and did studies and to see whether people actually could employ the basic rules of logic, including people who teach logic, including people who like have taken a semester of logic. It turns out they can't perform the most basic kind of logic with any consistency. That to me is instructive. And so maybe we talk about a philosophy and a theology from below. And what we see in the Hebrew Bible is we get the other part that says, well, we do come up from the earth. The man is not called Adam. There's nobody named Adam in the Bible. He's called the dirtling or the dirt one or the soiling or something like that. He comes up from the ground. It was just, there was supposed to be another way, but it's not like God made the man. And you get this in worship. I don't know if in Brazil you have bad worship music, bad worship lyrics.
Definitely.
Yeah, we definitely do.
But, you know, this kind of view that, oh, I am so finite and God is infinite, as if that's a problem or that's some kind of, and we view that as a limitation and we put all these negative words. But as far as we can tell from Genesis 2, the man was created with two eyes that point in one direction, which means it has mostly a blind spot. He's not meant to be an omni-visioned person. I don't think his brain was this big and could hold all the facts of the universe. He was still a perspectival creature that needed a strong ally, a zer conegdo, however you want to translate that word, suitable mate, who kind of was his opposite. I mean, conegdo means kind of like the one facing him, the one who is opposite, because you need someone to watch your back. And, you know, you think about the 6 blind men around the elephant all trying to describe. They just need to talk to each other, right? So the biblical story is not the blind men need to see and then become omniscient. That's not what solves the story in the biblical storyline. The biblical storyline, even from Eden, before anything went wrong, is those blind men need to talk to each other so they can better know what the elephant is elephantly. And if you don't know that analogy, I'm sorry. It's 6 blind men who all think the part of the elephant they grabbed is the elephant. So that maybe is like the science from below, which I think a lot of scientists themselves have a weird relationship between philosophy of science and the practice of science. So you can be, like I said, an excellent scientist who really does know what you're talking about and not really fully philosophically understand how it is what you do works in the wider world. In scripture, I think of examples, if I can go back to ritual. I just had a chapter come out in a book. I was rereading it for something else. I had forgotten about this chapter, but I looked at the rituals and just in Genesis alone. And so the Akedah, or we call the sacrifice of Isaac, in Genesis 22. I became a Christian when I was 20. And so I read all of these stories, not as an adult, but whatever a 20-year-old is. And I remember being surprised by this when the angel of God stops. Well, Genesis 22 opens with the sentence, and God sought to test Abraham. Right, so he's trying to find something invisible out about Abraham. And when the angel stops him from killing his son, he says, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God. And so we find out strikingly that Genesis 22 is about God coming to know something. right? Whatever that means. However you work that out systematically, that's your problem. But the text is not afraid to say it this way. Now, do I think God actually came to know something new there? I don't know. I don't have any strong feelings about that. But they're at least portraying the angel of God in that way. The angel comes by. God comes down to see what the people of Babel are doing. God goes into the village of Sodom and Gomorrah to see if the report that's come up to him is altogether true. So God is, in Genesis, is always going to showing up places in order to find things out. That to me is indicative. Those are like clues about what they think about how you know things and how you know things with controls on them, right? So when I think of, I can give lots of examples, but Gideon's fleece is probably the best example because he wants to know if God is actually sending him on this, what would be a suicide mission. And he says, okay, well, let me lay out a fleece and make it wet on the fleece, the sheep's, it's not fur, wool, the sheep's wool.
Wool, yeah.
Yeah. And dry on the ground around. He wakes up the next morning, and that's exactly what happened. And any Bedouin who lives in Israel today can tell you, well, yeah, that happened. That's actually that's a Bedouin technique for collecting water in the desert. Apparently you can collect up to 2 liters of water in a sheep's wool if you get enough moisture overnight. And so he seems to have realized that he didn't have a control on the experiment, as we would say today. And so he actually asked for the reverse, which is meteorologically impossible, that the ground be wet, but the wool be dry. Like that cannot happen naturally. And that's, and that didn't even fully convince him. But when God did that, it at least made him move on to the next step, which he still had to be convinced a little bit more. That to me tells me something about what the biblical authors, I would say God as well, but maybe we can keep it minimal and say that tells me the biblical authors value skepticism, they value confirmation, they value controlled scenarios. I mean, and so in some ways we were talking about bridging the worlds, like their world thinks like this and our world thinks like that. Actually, what I'm trying to argue is we think very similarly to them. I might argue because of them. I did not realize how radical this was until I started working in ancient Near Eastern. I was in a workshop with Egyptologists and Assyriologists, and come to find out, nobody in the ancient Near East thinks like this. Like nobody. Nobody uses rituals in order to understand anything. They don't connect ritual and knowing together. Nobody thinks in terms of control groups. And there's people who are trying to make that case with Mesopotamian text and science. Not even, and the Greeks don't even think like this, right?
And this is the reason why in the beginning of your book, I took note of footnote 11. You mentioned,
tell me what it says.
That's right. You mentioned that the Hebrews had strong convictions about material cause and effect, and they broke with Mesopotamian and Egyptian thought, being more rationally oriented, being the first examples of critical intellectualism and a skeptical mood. Yeah, that's what you wrote on that footnote. And this would be the examples then for that exact thing.
Yes.
Yeah, that was another question that I had for you, okay. For you to give examples of that. Yeah. And you just gave one. Very good. Thank you.
I want to point out too that don't believe me, because I'm not an ancient Near Eastern scholar. I was quoting there in that footnote ancient Near Eastern scholars who are saying this about the Hebrew Bible over and against their own traditions they study.
That's very interesting. Wow, that's through the force. Thank you for your question, Tiago. Thank you, Professor. Well, before inviting Ana for her second question, I have a question that touches on your thinking and your framework about biblical epistemology. And I think one of your very interesting claims is that when we think of knowledge in the Bible is more concerned with practice, knowing practices than with knowledge states. And linking that with Michael Polanyi and Thomas Kuhn, they are sociologists of science saying exactly the same thing. And in your framework, the role of the authority is very important, right? They're all knowing processes. There's no knowledge without an authority who guides, how you look, how you understand, or as you said before, give us the good biases to look onto the world in a certain way. My question would be a kind of concern with overstating the role of the authority in the process of knowing, thinking in the case of the church right now in the world. When we see polls in US and in Brazil, many times the evangelicals are among those who most share and believe in fake news and conspiracy theorists. And many times this is part of knowing processes where they are within echo chambers or communities where there is this authority, a kind of prophet-liking figure, maybe the pastor or a political leader who is an evangelical as well. And they trust blindly, almost, right? So how can this same framework give us some hope or point us to better knowledge practices for those who, because from the point of view of a lay person, usually they are not able to distinguish between who is actually an epistemic authority and who is just a pretendee. So how the Bible help us to navigate this kind of issues?
Man, you guys always have such excellent questions. Yeah, so this is good. I do have an article with Christianity Today on, I think they called it "Jesus Cares About Your Conspiracy Theory" or something, where I actually lay out.
Very good article, by the way.
Yeah, we read it.
Just very interesting to me that the biblical authors cared about conspiracy theories in some ways. So I think this is a great example of, I would argue, and you can tell me if you're wrong because you do real epistemology, is something that looks superficially similar, but when you get down under it, it's not similar. So for instance, with the conspiracy thing, it's been very interesting. I'm going to say interesting because I don't want to use any sad words, but to watch American culture over the last 10 years and how this has grown, and it's particularly fallen on a particular subset of Americans, this kind of conspiracy thinking. Although I went to a Brazilian church and they were just as much into it as Americans were, right?
Yes.
But what I've also noticed is they don't actually trust authority. It really is that incurvitas that Augustine talks about. Like, it really is they trust themselves at the end of the day. Because if any one of those conspiracy theorists that they're listening to, said, hey, you know what? I actually went up on the, Elon Musk rocket and I talked to a bunch of scientists and I've actually become convinced that I was wrong about that. Most of these people, they'll just cut that person off, right? Like, and I've seen this happen where people change their mind or they think something else has happened. So it's not that they're really trusting that authority. At the end of the day, it's still something about the idea they've become convinced of, and then it becomes their own, and no evidence can say anything to the opposite, which is, I would say, epistemically the most dangerous position any human being can be in. And I don't mean just like epistemically, like philosophically. I mean, if you're a husband who has become convinced that your wife is cheating on you, though she is not, that becomes physically dangerous for that person, right? It becomes bad for the husband. It's bad for the wife, right? It's mutually torturous. Numbers 5 actually has a ritual by which the husband's jealousy, when he is wrong, can be dispelled. And it emphasizes very heavily, though the husband has a spirit of jealousy, though the wife has done nothing, right? And so if she can go to the temple, go through this ritual, and the implication is when God declares her clean by going through this ritual, then the man needs to put away his jealousy, right? So I think the basic question, and this is coming from the biblical point of view, is authority is embedded in creation, including creation itself. And this is one of the things that I appreciate about the sciences that I wish more theologians would pick up. And that is that at the end of the day, all material scientists, at least, they actually believe creation has the right to tell them what creation is like. And they have ideas. On a good day, you have an idea about cell structures or, some microtubules in cells. And you actually have to go to the material world and construct a ritual by which you could understand microtubules better. And if the microtubules are not the way you thought they were, they will tell you through that ritual output. And the understanding in science is they're right and you're not, right? Now, I know there's all kinds of perverse incentives for scientists to make their research always, nobody publishes failed research, which they should, or failed theories or hypotheses. That's what I was looking for. So I think it's embedded in the nature of creation that, I was once a young man and I used to think lots of things about myself and my capabilities, and creation and my own body taught me, I thought I could play certain sports. Turns out I could not, right? But that is actually allowing an authority, because we all know people, and it's not just a religious issue. We know people who will deny and sequester and push through when creation is telling them, no, 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 no. They'll just ignore it or find some way around it. Or they'll, quite honestly, in the church, from my angle on the church, is they go hyper spiritual. They just start spiritualizing everything, right? So dangerous, so dangerous. So I really appreciate that about the sciences. And I wish theologians had an ounce, or like a kilogram of that energy that says, I need creation to double check me and see whether what I'm saying is true. And you notice in the Darwin book, at the end, I have all of these theological speculations, but I said, look, if there's something true about my speculations, now maybe they're not good speculations, but I said, you should be able to see aspects of this in the physical biological world today. Like if the new heavens and new earth is true, and I've captured the metaphysics of the new heavens and new earth, you actually should be able to look around the world and see evidence of a coming new heavens and new earth today in some ways, right? And we could argue about whether the ways I specified work or not. So creation is your number one. Your second is you are raised by an authority. You enter the world through your mother. Paul, talks about this. We enter, if you think you're great because you're a strong man in the world, well, guess what? You were born of a woman. We all come in through parental authority. And I think, Proverbs 1-9, it's listen, my son, to your father's instruction and your mother's Torah, or Torot in that sense, that's the only place where the Torah is not coming, instruction's not coming from God, it's coming from a human, and it's the woman, it's the mother. And so we have this strong teaching that your parents are your first explainer, they're your first authority, they're your first ritual scripter who says, if you want to understand this, okay, well, do these things, right? And then you'll kind of see what we're talking about. And then you can extend that authority. It's one of the great things about going to schools of various sorts is you have to submit to different authorities. And you don't have to agree with all of them, but you do have to submit to their practices that they prescribe in order to see what they're showing you, even if at the end of the day, you don't think that what they're showing you is the right thing to look at, or you think they should have different practices. So I don't know, in American academia, we have this thing we say about everything. It's not a matter of whether you're submitting to authorities or not. It's just how well and consistently you're doing it. And I think conspiracy theory actually cuts across all of this by moving all the authoritative power back on me, which just seems stupid. And so, for so many different reasons, right?
That's really, really good. Thank you, Joe. That's a lot of food for thought, but very, very good. Thank you.
I say that as a former pastor of a charismatic non-denominational church. So I have actually had to sit and deal with people, good people who have good spiritual lives, but thought, well, God told me, therefore. And there was no other way around, right? So this shows up in all kinds of places.
Very dangerous. Yes, good. Thank you. Ana, please, can you ask your second and last question, please?
Okay, so actually my question is totally a different matter. It's about your book on Darwin, that I will not be able to say the entire title because of that word with H. So you have you have an interesting chapter on sex and generation in that book, and you say, as you say, and we see in our world, sex means self-realization, maybe self-affirmation, among other things. I would like that you could tell us a little bit about the account of what the account of Genesis has to teach us about this matter.
Can I add to that? Because I had a similar thing, and maybe it will help you, Dr. Johnson. You made a distinction between reproduction and generation, which is very interesting, and it's quite difficult to grasp. I had to read like 3 times that paragraph in the introduction there to actually understand. So if you could explain that, talking about this.
No, thank you because that actually helps me explain Anna's question as well. I actually originally used the terms procreation and propagation, but the editor felt like propagation might distract some Christian readers who came from more traditional views of creation. So I went with generation, but maybe that caused more confusion. But essentially, it's this: and I'll be honest with you, it was fascinating reading the evolutionary biology because I just didn't know how evolutionary biologists thought about like gender difference. I didn't know that the fact that there are males and females of all kinds of species is an embarrassment to evolution, right? That if evolution had gone correctly, it would all be asexual reproduction. That's the most efficient form, right? But for various biological reasons, the assumption is it's split off into genders, and then you have to deal with that. And now you have people doing mating dances and dying to have sex, basically, all the way up to humanity. Dying, sex is worth dying for, right? I think I quote Foucault in there. It was then, as someone who's worked in Genesis 1 through 11, astonishing to me to go back and go, okay, Genesis 1, it's male and female. Now, male and female is the image of God. Male and female, it also happens in the animal. So, gender is not something unique to humans, obviously. But it does go out of its way to poetically state he made them in his image, male and female, he created them, right? And so whatever the image of God is, it has male and femaleness in it, whatever that means, right? Now, I'll leave it to the systematics to work out all the problems with what I'm saying here. But which means in Genesis 1, it's already talking about sex. It's talking about the purpose of sex, to be fruitful and multiply, and that this is fundamental to what it means to be a human, and that gender differentiation is fundamental. And then I also was not aware, I'll talk about sexual assault in a second. So what is sex for? Well, we think procreation, having babies. But then, anybody who's read Genesis, you pretty quickly realize, well, they're not just talking about Abraham. I mean, he says, I'm going to make a nation out of you, right? And then he had one child. 2, depending on how you count, right? Isaac and Ishmael. And you can see the thinking of the author of Genesis is having children actually means having grandchildren and great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. Which means that, and so procreation means I'm thinking about my own children. And when I want to have my own children, how old am I? Family planning, as we would call it today. Propagation or generation is actually thinking about creating a line that will persist on the face of the earth of humans that are like you. And you get this in Genesis 5, where it says, Seth was made in the image of Adam, right? And the image of the dirtling. So you got that sense of you're creating things in your line, in your genetic line, as we would say today. Which, the interesting thing about that for me is that really changes the game when you think about ecological ethics, when you think about raising your children, when you think about like Deuteronomy 6, how you raise your children, that you speak about these things as you go along the way, that whatever you're doing right now should always be looking over the horizon at your great-great-great-grandchildren, whom you will never meet. But what you're doing today should be in order that they and their children will have this relationship with God for the sake of all the families of the earth. You get this even in Acts 2, because I know everybody thinks everything in the Old Testament dies in the New Testament or something and is reborn. But Acts 2 mimics this thinking, saying, When Peter gives a speech, well, brothers that were cut to their heart, and they said, "What shall we do?" And he said, repent and be baptized, all of you, and this promise is for you and your children and all who are far off, who God is going to call. Right. So there's always this over the horizon look, and both in time and geography. Right. All the families of the earth. Why is Abraham going to have a nation? In order to bless all the families of the earth, which is kind of the geographical over the horizon, or the topological. And then it's for his children chronologically over the horizon that he can't see. Which makes the issue of sexual assault, it cuts across, we know sexual assault is wrong, right? An atheist in America knows that is wrong. But when you consider it on those two axes of generation or propagation, considering over the horizon thinking, it cuts across all of that. It says, I don't want to know the person who I'm assaulting, right? I don't want to have intimate knowledge. I want to have intimacy without knowledge of the person. I don't want to have a relation with the children. I don't care about the great-great-grandchildren. I don't care, it basically cuts every single root of sexuality that's laid down in Genesis and pulls it out and says, I don't care about it. On top of all the other horrible things that come with sexual assault, on top of all of that, it's dehumanizing in every single aspect. Every theological aspect of the word dehumanizing, sexual assault captures that. What was really sad, I'm not going to lie to you, I was a little bit excited to write the chapter on sex because I thought, well, this will be interesting reading, maybe a little bit more interesting than, niche habitat making or something. And then I was quickly disabused of my ideas because essentially I learned that when you have the unique situation of males in general in the animal kingdom want to have sex more than females. They have a greater libido, as we would say. Even Darwin noticed this. Even my daughter noticed this at the zoo. She once said of two prairie dogs who were making love, she said, "Oh, the one in back looks really serious, but the one in front looks like she doesn't care at all." And I was like, yeah, that's exactly right. So when you have the libido of the male, now most animals in the world, the females are larger than the males or they're same size, right? So you have a subset of animals where the males are larger. So when they're when they have different morphology and the males are bigger and stronger, you have the unique ability to basically propagate sexual assault. So hominids, dolphins, ducks, it's not the case, but ducks have a whole other horrible sexual assault habit going on. So there's something about humans that actually sexual assault is more possible because the males are bigger than the females, and the males have a stronger libido, which makes sexual assault more probabilistic, which again, you read through Genesis and you see issues of sexual assault. I mean, you read through the whole Bible, issues of sexual assault keep on getting raised up. It's universally negative. And the only kind of bad sex that has a glimmer of hope to it is Tamar with Judah, where she pretends to be a prostitute. But again, it was because she was thinking generationally. I don't want my line to be cut off from the face of the earth. So I want to think. And now you can kind of hear how it wasn't always difficult to put the biblical conversation in conversation with evolutionary biology, because they're thinking in very similar terms.
Wow.
I was trying to cover all of that. Sorry.
No, that's very interesting. That's so much, for us to thinking in this biblical world and their ways of seeing and experience the world and the relationship with our concerns. And as you have claimed, it's not as distinct as people think about it. Like science and religion, as faith and science are two whole distinct worlds. Actually not. We are much more in debt to the biblical world than usually we think. Good. Tiago, you have time for your final quick question.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Dr. Johnson, you throughout your work, again, you do very deep reading of the Bible. You take it very seriously, and you always warn us that we should move beyond like a flat reading of the Bible. And then in this book of evolution, what had Darwin to do with the Bible, you mention two ways of reading that still don't make justice to the Bible itself, to the text itself. And then you mentioned the hyper literalist, like young earth creationists, but you also mention the evolutionary creationists who usually emphasize the aspects of ancient cosmology, ancient views of nature, but you mentioned that they still don't go enough, right? And you're trying to make some kind of, I wouldn't say a middle point, but you try to go even beyond that, mentioning the whole thing about the philosophical thought and the philosophical world of the Hebrew Bible. My question is, how do you feel, and what would be your advice? How do you feel when you see that most readers of the Bible in America, in England, where you are now, and even in Brazil, they still don't get through the very flat reading? They're not even considering the ancient language and the ancient cosmology that I noticed that you accept, of course.
Yeah.
But so most people are not even there, and they get scandalous when we mention these things, these ancient notions of cosmology that the Bible contains. So most people are still, especially in the evangelical world, they're still stuck in a very flat reading. And now you're mentioning that you have to go past that, go past the second layer, let's call it, to realize the ancient world.
Yeah.
But you're going even deeper, going to the philosophy. How do you get to that stage when people are still stuck? And how do you feel about that? And what would you advise us to do in order to get to this deeper level of reading the Bible?
Well, you need to go over to hebraicthought.org, where all of our articles are translated into Portuguese.
Oh, cool.
Thanks to Igor. And so we do have lots of readings of these kinds, or people taking contemporary issues, doing what I'm doing in the Darwin book, taking contemporary issues, trying to think, okay, how do the biblical authors deal with this issue? Yeah, I had a whole section in the book that I took out, which was critiquing these theistic evolutionary creationists. How I know they go under different names now, but how they kind of do this. Well, history starts at Genesis 12. Everything before that is kind of legend and cosmological and functional, not historical. Which again, I'm sympathetic to a lot of the moves that they're trying to make. I took it out because it was just basically naming people's books and saying why they were wrong, and I felt like that was just too distracting. And I know everybody wants that, but I don't. That's not my energy, as the kids say. I take it back. I would love to do that because I love to tell people why they're wrong, but it's my sinful part that wants to do that. What I suggest is, the most simple thing is to read it as literature, because once you realize now this is going to sound so simple that someone might miss the point. If Genesis 2, for instance, God makes the man out of dirt. The dirt, he's not even called the man, he's called the dirt thing. He makes the dirt thing out of the dirt, breathes the breath of light, and then he looks at him and says, it's not good that he should be alone. And now at that point, anybody who's reading should say, oh, that sounds like we're in a story. And a story has a conflict, rising tension, climax, resolution, not always a climax, but a resolution. Which means if you want to know what Genesis 2 is, if you just ask people what's Genesis 2 about, they'll give you, I do this in class, and you can get 20 answers. And you say, okay, yeah, well, how do we know which one of those 20 is better? We don't have to say right. We can just say which ones are better and which ones are worse. And I would say the answer is always going to be, well, if I'm an author and I wrote a story that has a conflict that comes to resolution, whatever I was trying to tell you has to have some relevance to that conflict and resolution, because there's 100 different ways you can tell the same story. There's different emphases. And so if you're reading narrative in scripture and you can't answer the question, what is the climax and resolution of the story? Because you can kind of work backwards. If you know what the resolution is, then you know, logically speaking, what the conflict must be, right? Or something like what it is. So I think reading text as literature helps you get some of the dogma and the assumptions and the things we've never really thought through. We just repeat, like, so when I say God says, now I know that you fear me, the typical Christian, when they read that, at least in my classroom, is they'll say, wait, I thought God was omniscient. And I'll say, okay, maybe he is. Let's just set that to the side and see how the biblical authors are going to unfold. We're in the first 5 minutes of the movie about God. Let's not act like we've got them all figured out at this point. So some of it is allowing your assumptions to be broken up, like concrete, like a jackhammer. Let the biblical text break up some of our assumptions, and not just break up our assumptions like deconstructing, but allow it to reconstruct for us. Like Inigo Montoya, I don't know if you know this movie, Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word, right? They keep revisiting concepts and ideas over and over again, telling you what they think is important. And sometimes it's shocking. Of course, Jesus does the same thing, and he does it in the most shocking way possible. But unless you pay attention to those literary moves, then it's just a game of like, well, this is what it means to me, and this is what it means to you, but we can't ever bridge that gap. And we can't ever talk about what we talk about with everything else in the world. This is a better way to do it, and this is a worse way to do it. And so I think the literary way is the way forward. And by literary, I don't mean the Hebrew, and I don't mean any kind of historical background. Because I'm convinced that billions of Christians before 1800, before we ever dug up clay tablets and interpreted them from Mesopotamia, understood what Genesis was about. And that Egyptology and Assyriology do not explain to us determinatively what Genesis 1 through 11 is about. It might illuminate some things that we wouldn't have known otherwise, but it doesn't determine. The literary structure actually does determine.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. We are a bit ahead of time. So, Tiago, do you like to ask your very quick, direct, funny, silly questions?
Yes, I was just going to say that it's very interesting that you do all this scholarly work, like very deep scholarly work that you do, but you're also very interested in propagating that, like sending out to the public with Hebraic thought and other projects that I know that you have your podcast. So that's very interesting, which brings me to my question, which is you're a big scholar, but you're also a very down-to-earth person who has done a lot in your life. Like Marcelo said in the beginning, you're an Army veteran, as far as I know.
Air Force.
Right? Air Force, not Army. That's right.
I don't know if that counts, but
yeah. and I mean, you've done a lot. You're a pastor. And of course, you mentioned you played drums at a punk rock band. So my question is, as I have my basses here with me, because I also play in a rock band, do you still play drums, or do you still listen to punk rock? That was my question.
Yes, and I don't play in a band just because life has not allowed me to. I would if I could, and of course, drums are the worst. Because you have to carry them to the club or whatever. I did up until probably 15 years ago, actively play in bands. And yes, I still do. There's something very soothing to me about listening to the Cro-Mags when I work out. So I was kind of hardcore / punk. Yeah.
Cool. You still listen?
Yes, I still listen.
But do you still have a drum set to practice, like an electronic drum set or something? You do.
Yep.
So you play a little bit sometimes.
Yes, my drumming is much better than when I was in punk.
Oh,
good.
Not great. I can't do jazz drumming or anything.
But do you play in church? Do you play worship bands stuff in church ministry?
No. Go back to my conversation about worship.
Okay. Cool.
I fill in when they don't have anybody. I'll fill in drums, but no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, in the name of Academia ABC², I'd like to thank Professor Dr. Johnson. Thank you very much for your time, for your intelligence, for your patience with our questions. That was an awesome time for us to grow in knowledge. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure. Genuine pleasure.
Yeah, it was very good.